Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are going to pick up with just talking a little bit about the fact that when we talk sexual reproduction, we spend so much time talking about what happens in us as animal cells, that we forget that not every organism's life cycle looks identical to ours. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today just talking about some other types of life cycles that exist in this relationship to cell division and fertilization. So, just in general, a life cycle is the generation to generation sequence of stages in the reproductive history of that organism, of that species. So, we tend to see three major types of sexual life cycles that exist, really based on the timing of meiosis, timing of the fertilization, and then how do we actually create the gametes. So, these life cycles are dependent on whether or not their haploid cells or their diploid cells are the ones that are doing the bulk of division via mitosis. Um, Regardless, though, the meiosis process has to go from diploid to haploid, right? So the question then becomes, well, what happens after that meiotic division? How do we end up creating that adult life form? How do the gametes form? Is that directly being taken care of by meiosis, or is mitosis playing a role there as well? So when we look at animals, this is what we tend to spend most of the time focusing on, because it's what happens in us. So when we look at this meiosis, the only purpose to that process is to take those diploid cells, half the genetic information to make the gametes, and that's it. So the only cells that we see in animals that are haploid are the gametes themselves. They'll come back together via fertilization, create another zygote offspring. That zygote will then go through mitosis to form that diploid multicellular organism. And then as that organism matures to adulthood, they will then go through that process of meiosis again to create the gametes and start the generational transition over again. But it's not the only option. So when I look at plants and algae, some of them exhibit this idea of alternation of generations. If you've ever walked through the woods and looked at ferns, they are a really awesome, easy example to see this in a plant species. So they have both diploid and haploid multicellular stages. So when we look at these guys, we look at the diploid form. All right, if you've ever looked at those ferns and some of the little um, sort of curlicue fronds, those are their actual diploid stage, where they are producing the spores. And so that is the sporophyte generation. So they will go through fertilization, create and that zygote from the union of gametes. Those gametes then, when they join and form that zygote will go through mitosis and form the diploid multicellular organism, that sporophyte. That sporophyte will then go through meiosis and create the spores. So if you've ever flipped over the frond of a fern and saw all those little dots, all right, those are the production of their gametes. So those spores actually are haploid cells. They produce that sort of big frond leafy structure that most people think about as as ferns. Um, but they get created via these spores. Those spores then go through mitosis, create that adult. That adult's cells then also go through mitosis to create their gametes, which come back together through fertilization and produce that diploid organism again. So we end up seeing this alternation where one generation is haploid, and that's the gametophyte, that's the big, if we're talking these ferns, the big leafy component. Um, and then when it goes through meiosis, it creates the spores that then create the next generation, which is the sporophyte and is diploid. And then that will go through and alternate back and forth, which is kind of interesting. We can also limit very much the component of how much of the multicellular organism, or in some cases unicellular organisms, are diploid. And so when we see a lot of fungi and most protists that we see in the animal kingdom, these guys actually spend the vast majority of their adult life as haploid cells, not diploid ones. So they don't really have a multicellular diploid stage. Instead, we'll bring those gametes together to allow that fertilization to happen, to allow for the increase in genetic variation, right? Go back to that idea of evolution and increasing their variation in their gene pool. They'll do that, but they'll only spend time as a it's a diploid organism, two-end organism in that zygote. That zygote will then quickly go through meiosis and start producing their adult haploid form, which is pretty cool.